Old Testament, it's called, or I title it as the letter of Jeremiah. The letter of Jeremiah. The word Jeremiah means the Lord lifts. So therefore this letter can be titled as the letter of the Lord lifting you up. The letter of the Lord lifting you up in whatever situation you are in. So that's how the theme goes. Nevertheless, Jeremiah wrote a letter, and I was surprised to see, I read the Bible many times. Let me quote. I'm quoting from a godly man, and his name is James Niles. James Niles. He says something like this. Maybe one day I speak on this. He says, everything in this world will die one day. Only the Word of God is eternal. Only the Word of God is eternal, and everything else will die off. And then he goes on to say like this. I am surprised, and I'm challenged and encouraged. This is what Brother James Niles says. He says, I wonder why so little people or so less people go to something which is eternal, and vast majority going for something which is not eternal. I can't understand the logic of it. That's what he said. Well, okay, with that introduction, let's study the book of Jeremiah from chapter 29, entitled The Letter of Jeremiah. The Letter of Jeremiah. I have few things to share. One, the people of God. Two, the prophet of God. 3, the enemy of God. 4, the solution of God. 5, the plans of God. And then 6th one, the warnings of God. And then lastly, the promises of God. All from Jeremiah chapter 29. This morning I just wrote down as I meditated on this particular chapter. So therefore, this is something very, very fresh, not something which I produced some other day, yesterday. It's not an old meal, it's a fresh meal. Okay, first of all, the people of God. You know, in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 1, these are the words of the letter which Jeremiah, the prophet, sent from Jerusalem to the rest of the elders, priests, prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So, the condition of God's people, they are in bondage. They are in bondage. It's a sad thing to have God's people in bondage because it's a paradox. Paradox is two opposite statements put together in order to bring a truth. And so the people of God were supposed to be free, and we see they are in exile. One reason why they were in exile, they rejected the Word of God, they rejected the God of the Word, and they rejected the spiritual father. So because of this condition, they were taken into exile for 70 long years. Secondly, we see something about the prophet of God, who is a spiritual father, and I see Jeremiah very often in this book with a very moving kind of sentiment, the emotion that he carries towards God's people and the leaders. And in fact, Jeremiah was a very emotional kind of man. I can easily identify myself with Jeremiah. How often I went into some kind of, emotional kind of attachment, emotional kind of, a kind of response or reaction. I can very well align with this spiritual father, prophet Jeremiah. In fact, there is a book called the Book of Lamentation. The Book of Lamentation, where we see so much of Jeremiah's crying, emotions poured in. Well, let's move to the next point, that is the enemy of God. The enemy of God, we saw the people of God, and the prophet of God, who is the spiritual father, and the enemy of God. The enemy of God is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The word Babylon or Babel also could mean confusion, leader of confusion, or someone who put God's people in bondage. That's what we see in chapter 29, verse 1 and 3. And it is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who took, first of all, the elders, and then he took priests and prophets and all the people of God into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Well, what a sad picture. It starts with God's people in exile by the enemy. Looks like the enemy is having an upper hand. Looks like the enemy is almost winning. Looks like the enemy has got a last word to say, something like that. But God gives a very, very strange solution. What is that strange solution? The solution of God is found in chapter 29 and verse 7 of the same letter of Jeremiah. God says, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf." Behalf. Somebody this morning said, on behalf of somebody I wanted to speak. And so here is God saying, on behalf of the city of Babylon, pray for its welfare, and you will have welfare. The word welfare in the Hebrew is shalom. And this verse 7 has got the word shalom 3 times. You want to have a shalom. Shalom is not just an absence of war. It's more than that. It's a package of 7 things. One day maybe I should speak about 7 meanings of shalom. And so here we see God saying, you wanted to wanted the city, you want the enemy to have shalom, and God says, I have sent you into exile. I thought it's Nebuchadnezzar who took God's people into exile, but God says, no, I have taken you people into exile, and pray to the Lord on behalf of the enemy city, and pray for the shalom, and you will have shalom. Wow. What a formula. Nowhere I have seen this kind of statement. Of course, Jesus came later and said something like that, wonderful. But in the Old Testament, we see when you pray for the shalom of your enemy, and you get your shalom also. In blessing the enemy, you get the blessing. That's what God is trying to say here. And then we move to the plans of God. We saw a little bit about the people of God, prophet of God, enemy of God, solution of God. What is the solution? Pray for the shalom of your enemy, and you get your package of shalom. And then the plans of God, that famous, well-known verse in Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11, I know the plans that I have for you, plans It's a good plans. Again, it says plans for welfare or plans for shalom and not for calamity, to give you a future, a good future, and a good hope. That is the plans of God. The paradox here is God's people are still living in bondage, and here comes the plan of God. Plan of God will operate even when things goes adverse, opposite of your expectation. And then, we see something about the warnings of God. I was surprised this morning to make a note. Jeremiah wrote a letter, the letter of Jeremiah. But there were others also who wrote letters and sent to the people of God, and God was unhappy about them. So there was a duplicity or a duplication of the letter. And in same chapter 29, verse 25, God says, you guys have sent letters in your own name to all the people who are in Jerusalem. There was a duplicate message. Something which is, I remember my spiritual father saying something like this. He said, that which is precious, the devil will duplicate. You don't hear about duplicate 1 rupee coin or something like that. You hear something about big duplication of gold or silver like that. So in the same way, the letter of Jeremiah was something precious, and here the devil duplicated, and God noticed it, and God is against that, and he rebuked them. And some of these letters, some people brought to the spiritual father and said, this is what somebody else has done. So the warnings of God, that's what we see. In closing, the promises of God. The promises of God. How to encash the promises of God. Here is a verse that comes up that has been a blessing to me. Jeremiah 29 verse 13. You seek me and you'll find me when you search for me with all your heart. That is the promise of God. God can be found. Sometimes God is not found because we are not seeking with all our heart. I'm not seeking God I'm seeking maybe second place to God, or the 10th place to God, and the 99th place to God. But when you seek God with all your heart, God commits himself and says, you will find me. Wow. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, verse 14, and I will restore. Wow, this is a super word. Restore your fortunes. Fortunes could also mean captivity. I will gather you from all the places, and I will bring you back to the place from where I sent to you. That is, back to Jerusalem, so that they can have the house of God, the temple of God, and the blessings of God, and the promised land of God. Well, this is God's plan for each one of us. God bless you. Shalom.